everybody. Welcome to the Fire It Up with CJ show. We are going to be talking about decision making, which is completely related to the art of risk. And we have Kate Sukol here talking about the art of risk. And we're going to learn all about the neuroscience and genetics of taking risk and making decisions. And we're going to map you through some how you can actually use this material to make better decisions. So welcome, Kate.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Oh, it's been, I have to admit that literally moments before, before this interview, I was typing up all of my notes. I literally have 4 pages of notes for the blog post because first of all, I got absolutely enthralled with all the huge amount of research that you did in writing this book and the number of people that you talked to make sure that I mean you're a journalist, so I'm sure this is what you do, right, as a journalist.
Well, but it's funny because I think a lot of where I think this book became really fascinating for me is I'm a science writer, so usually I'm talking to the scientists.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you can never find really great advice in a scientific paper. They
Right.
they tend to take a step back and say, well, maybe there are lots of caveats and
Right.
exceptions and whatever because it's a controlled study.
Right.
But I also spoke to a lot of real world risk takers from very different domains. And hearing their opinions and their thoughts and then comparing and contrasting it with what the scientists had to say, and then finding that it really dovetailed nicely.
Yeah.
I think that's what really, it actually surprised me when I started writing the book. I kind of thought that I was going to be writing a book about superheroes as opposed to, everyday sort of decision making. But it really led me to a fascinating end.
Yeah,
So.
and what I loved is, and for folks who haven't read the book, so in the Art of Risk, you talk to a brain surgeon, you
Mhm.
talk to people who do extreme sports, you talk to teenagers who jump off roofs. Um,
Yes.
And you talk to like ordinary people like Michelle, who we're going to talk about later, who's just
Right.
trying to make a decision about which job to take. And so there are all these different types of people that you talk to. I love that you actually married the scientific with, real life people, because it helped me ground into like understanding like, oh, how can I actually make this research applicable? And in fact, the reason why I was typing all these notes is because I would say over the last couple of weeks, literally the last 4 weeks, I've been having to make a lot of really important decisions about leaving a job, uh, and uh, and I'm on a board now where we're going to have to decide whether we're in a financial situation where we're going to have to decide whether we fold shop or not. So like really risky decisions with not a lot of information,
Yeah.
and what this book allowed me to do is understand the structure of what a good decision is all about and why it's hard for some people to make decisions and why it's easier for others. So that's where I wanted to start off. Um, Tell me a little bit when you talk to the scientists, of neuroscientists, you talk about the brain and how the brain operates. I found that fascinating. And you mentioned throughout the whole book. I love it. So tell us a little bit about the basal ganglia and the prefrontal regulator, and it's part of some. Oh, I don't even know the name of the system. It's part of
The mesocortical limbic circuitry.
yes, thank God you're a
Yeah,
science writer. Please help us interpret
sure.
these
So,
complicated words.
more and more we're learning that neuroscience is really important for understanding just basic everyday behavior. And some of our biggest, human existential kind of questions, it
Hmm.
all leads back to the brain.
Yes.
And what's kind of funny, it's 3 pounds of silly putty encased in our skull. We're still trying to kind of figure out what it is, how it works, what it does.
Right.
But some of these advances are really fascinating. So I guess the first thing I would say is if we were to distill down what the brain does into a single sentence, and of course this is a gross oversimplification, but I
Right.
think it's really important for understanding decision making, is that the brain is in the prediction business.
Hmm.
It is trying to figure out what is happening next in the world so that you can survive it and then hopefully, thrive.
Hmm.
And it processes all kinds of sensory information: eyes, ears, mouth, nose. It's getting all kinds of chemosensory signals from the air around you, from people around you. Most of it we're not even conscious of. And so in having to be able to predict what's coming next, it has to take a lot of shortcuts. It needs to try to optimize, because the other thing about the brain, 3 pounds of silly putty, it's 3 pounds of silly putty that takes up 20% of the body's energy resources.
Right.
So to conserve, it needs to try to filter out what it can. It needs to try to condense. It wants to automate as much as it can. And so we have this really sophisticated circuit. And it's called the mesolimbic
limbic circuit.
But basically what it comes down to is, deep in our brain, we have the basal ganglia. And some people call this the reptilian brain. Some might call it the reward centers of the brain. I like to call it like sort of the motivation center.
Right.
But it is the stuff that kind of pushes you to go after the things you want. And of course the things you need. So food, money, sex, prestige, all the best things in life. This center of your brain is saying, go, 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 go get it. That's what you need. And a lot of it you do need to survive. Of course, some of it we just like. We want it.
Right.
I don't need chocolate cake to survive.
Some people don't, but some people do.
Yeah, on Thursdays I probably. But of course, if we let that part of our brain go all the time, the world would be a pretty inhospitable place. We need to have a part of our brain that can say no, or at least not right now. Chocolate cake is great, but probably not 3 meals a day.
Right.
Sex, wonderful, not with your boss's husband.
Right.
It's a way of sort of really regulating the situation and saying, okay, we understand that you want these things or you're reacting to these things, but you need to hold off for right now. Right. So really any decision is a matter of these two areas of the brain kind of duking it out. Is the reward worth the consequences?
Right.
That really comes down to it. So where risk comes into all of that is, of course, again, brains in the prediction business.
Right.
Trying to figure out what's happening next. It really is uncertain. Is that clown who's coming towards you about to give you a balloon? Or is it a Stephen King kind of clown that's going to come and, stab you in the chest and make off with you to the sewer? You don't know, right? I mean, and whether or not you go to the circus or you read, Stephen King books, you're going to have a different idea.
Right.
So you have these areas of the brain called the limbic system, the brain's emotional systems. You have your memories. You have your experience that then feed in to that motivation center, the gas. And then the brain's prefrontal regulator, the brakes, to decide whether you should push forward or hold back. And, I think I talk about the clown as an example. It seems really silly, but, you have to think about how much experience and context plays a role in how you view a certain situation. Even something as simple as going on a walk in the morning, if you see a dog coming towards you, I'm a dog lover. I have a puppy sleeping at my feet right now. I'm the one who's going to probably run up and start, can I pet your puppy?
Right.
But somebody who's afraid of dogs, who had a bad experience with dogs, they may go and walk in the other direction, cross the street.
Right.
That experience really weights how you view the risk.
Right.
And that's going to really alter whether, as these two areas of the brains are kind of duking it out, whether you're going to push forward or hold back.
Right. And so you described that as a book and you just described it as the gas, which is your, I think, I'm sure I'm making the terms right. There's the fast thinking part of you. That's the gas, the reptilian, yes, give me the chocolate cake, sex. If I could do both at the same time, I also would like that.
I've done that before. I highly recommend it. Yeah.
Okay, so there's the gas, and then there's the brakes going, well, actually, the last time I had sex and chocolate cake, it was a little bit messy, and it took a lot of time to clean up.
Laundry for days. Right. Exactly. And saying, well, maybe the way, and then experience tells me I can mitigate that by putting old sheets on the bed or, borrowing the rubber sheet or whatever.
Right.
But that's basically how you break it down. And you can think of the brain as a calculator to a certain extent, and it's weighting all the variables.
Right.
And so your experiences and your knowledge as well. So maybe you haven't had, experience with chocolate and sex, but you saw this great video.
Right.
And that told you some other things about it. That's going to, alter the way that you actually decide whether to take that risk or not.
Right. I had no idea we'd be going into chocolate and sex, but hey, why not? That's a
Exactly.
good thing. Okay, so that's basically how our brain works. And then you
Mhm.
talk to some folks who are looking at genetics, and
Yeah.
you were trying to look at saying, hey, are there certain particular, are there any particular genes that actually are, why is it that some personalities are more prone towards risk and some people are not? And so you're looking at genetics and how they come to play. What did you find out when you investigated?
So this was fascinating for me because I really thought, I looked at a lot of work in genetics that there was something just profoundly different. And
Mm-hmm.
actually, there was a really interesting article in the New York Times. It's a few years ago now, but it was called "Are You a Warrior?" Warrior, or are you a worrier? Worrier. And it talked
Mm-hmm.
about this one particular gene. It's called MAOA.
Mm-hmm.
And it was said that people who had certain variants of these genes tended to be more anxious,
Mm-hmm.
and others tend to be more out there, go get you types. And
Mm-hmm.
so, reading about some of this stuff, I really thought, and especially as I watch some of these risk takers, especially like the extreme sports
Right.
people, I think, how do they do this? How do they even like decide, yeah, I really want to go climb up a, 400, flat-faced rock wall with no ropes and then jump off of it with a parachute? How does that
Yeah.
even occur to them?
Well, just for folks that haven't read The Art of Risk, you talk about this one woman whose husband actually died
Yes, because I think
climbing.
yeah, we tell ourselves they don't know the consequences. This
Right,
is why they can do it. They don't. And for her, she's a
right,
base jumper.
right.
Her name is Steph Davis. She's an amazing woman. Her husband passed away, and even after that, she still jumped again. And it's because it's something that she loves so much. So again, initially, I really thought that this might be about some kind of genetic variants that were
Right.
gonna, basically show why these people were so different than others.
Mm-hmm.
But even looking at, rock climbers, the kind of rock climbers that get to the top of Everest without oxygen, the people who are so sure about their business deals, who can play poker, who don't break a sweat ever. I thought, all right, there's going to be something over there. And
Mm-hmm.
certainly there's been work that's looked at different genes. One of interest is called the dopamine receptor gene,
Mm-hmm.
DRD4. So that circuit we were talking about earlier, the mesocortical limbic circuitry, there's dopamine. It kind of, that's what fuels it. And that's a neurotransmitter. Some people call it the pleasure chemical, but it's really a learning chemical.
Mm-hmm.
And it gets released in a huge flux when we do encounter something good,
Mm-hmm.
like sex or chocolate cake or both together, or
Right,
what have you.
right,
And it's actually the frontal lobes when it's saying, no, no, wait, that's not a good idea right now. That'll kind of dampen down the dopamine.
right.
So certain people have a variant where they have fewer of these dopamine receptors. So that means that there's a lot more dopamine running around in this circuit
Right.
saying, go, go, go. It's just hitting on the gas. And what's fascinating about this particular gene is that you can look at different domains and see that people who have this one variant, it's called the 7R plus, they tend to act in a riskier manner.
Mm-hmm.
They're more likely to engage in promiscuous sex. They're more likely to take a big gamble on a lottery task. They're more likely to, after they've been injured in an extreme sport, like snowboarding or whatever, they're more likely to get right back on as soon as they're recovered.
Mm-hmm.
And they're more likely to take risky bets in bridge, that
Mm-hmm.
nursing home favorite. That's what cracks me as well. You take it to the nursing home to, bidding in bridge, and you'll see that people with this variant will bid a lot more aggressively. And so that's really fascinating. What
Right,
is it exactly about this gene?
right.
But then there are also things like the warrior and warrior gene I talked about earlier. There's some serotonin genes that have been linked, various others. And I think that the real take home message is not that these people are really that genetically different. Because the question, of course, is are risk takers born or made?
Right.
But they have a little subtle difference.
Mm-hmm.
A gene, we talk a lot about a gene being linked to behavior, but a gene really makes a protein.
Mm-hmm.
And although that's kind of boring and more complicated when we went, but what I think one of the researchers I spoke to, Dr. Lum, who's at Binghamton University, he said, it's one gene and its contribution really is very small. But what it does is it changes the algorithm in your head just a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So that tango we were talking about between the gas and the brakes, between those different areas of the brain, that gene's contribution is just going to change the way that you weight the variables very slightly.
Mm.
And while from task to task it may not seem like a big deal, what will be, it means over time, over a lifetime, it's going to result in very different lives lived.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that, when somebody said to Steph Davis, hey, let's try, rock climbing, she was like, oh, yeah. And I
Right.
might have been like, I'm not
No
doing that
thanks.
without
Right.
ropes.
So
Are you
what was
crazy?
that gene? What was that gene that the doctor that geneticist was talking about?
He was talking about DRD4, which is the
Oh,
dopamine receptor gene. So,
okay.
so basically, over time, it's going to result in very different lives lived. So I
Mm-hmm.
think, what's interesting about the genetic side is that we all do have sort of baseline algorithms. We know who we are and how we approach risky situations. Some of us are more impulsive. We kind of tend to run towards risk. We like to try new things. We need more stress in our lives. We need more stimulation.
That's
Some
me.
of us are more risk averse. We
Right.
hold back. We can, our inner monologue will argue about whether or not to do something until the opportunity actually vanishes.
Yeah.
And so knowing about that about yourself, I think, is really important. And that's where
Right.
the genetic comes in. We all sort of have a baseline,
Right.
but biology never works in a vacuum. So even if you do have that kind of, genetic backdrop that pushes you, the predisposition to make you, run full steam ahead, to always kind of be pushing on the gas, there are actually a lot of different situations that may make you have you putting on the brakes.
You know what's
And
interesting?
certainly, of course, you can always push yourself if you know that about yourself to push on the brakes.
Right. And I think what's interesting is because as I was mapping what you're saying to my own kind of test that I took on risk, what I found is that I am a risk taker, and people often wonder, like, how can you even do that? Like, why did you decide to do that? That's
Mm-hmm.
crazy. And they go, you have a lot of courage. I'm like, no, I think it's just that I'm stupid. Um, I just don't. I'm probably not worrying too much, or maybe it's like you were saying in the book that we'll get into later, is that I have certain experiences that make me less fearful. But what's interesting is there's certain things I don't like risking on, and there's certain things that I would go on, and so I'm literally on the border between risk averse and taking risks. So, and if you look at behavioral tests that I've taken, I'm literally on the edge,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's interesting because I don't know, and I know you took the test yourself. You took a genetic test yourself because you
Yeah.
yourself used to have really risky behavior, right? Like
Yes.
tramping around. So tell us about what happened when you took the test and what you concluded with that.
Well, I'm actually not going to give the results so they can look
Okay.
at the book, but I will tell you that every single researcher I talked to said, "Oh, you absolutely have this genetic variant. I can tell just by meeting you that you
Right.
have this genetic variant."
Right.
And so I think that's really interesting because we think that there's a type. But like you said, in different situations, you may be risk averse. This was the other really fascinating thing I found about these real world risk takers I talked to. One guy, he actually didn't make the book. He was a firefighter, but and he mostly worked as an EMT.
Right.
And so he had some hilarious stories about these calls that he'd gone out on and like trying to get, naked people who were going through a psychotic episode into clothes. And
Oh
I
my
mean, he
God.
was really funny,
Right.
really, macho, really whatever. And I don't even know how it came up, but he started talking about taxes. And I told him, oh, yeah, I use TurboTax. You should try TurboTax. And all of a sudden, this macho deep voice goes into this little uppity squeak. What? You don't have an accountant? You're not using an accountant? So this guy who runs into burning buildings and who answers all of these crazy EMT calls where people are shooting each other started to freak out about the idea of not using an account. He's like, you could get audited. So for him, he's terrified of being audited by the IRS.
Right.
And I thought it was so funny because,
Yeah.
a lot of the things that he does, I think, no way, there's no way I could do that. Like the burning building thing, it's like I was sort of thinking about it. And I think if my child were inside, I'd probably go in after him. But
Right.
I might hesitate if there was a qualified professional nearby.
Right. Yeah, most
Um,
people would. Yeah.
but with the taxes, he was like, absolutely not, no way. And I don't even know. It was like this deep voice, all of a sudden, what? You know, it was nuts.
Well, I
So,
think it goes back to the thing that you're saying earlier in the example that you use. Well, you love puppy dogs, and someone who actually has gotten bitten by a puppy dog, well, I don't know, probably a regular dog, no puppies here,
right.
but they would probably be a little bit hesitant when they saw a dog. So his experience, why he has that experience, and memory of, oh my God, the IRS is out to get me, like,
Or, friends telling
yeah,
him that they've been
yeah,
audited and it was the worst experience of their life or
yeah,
what, so I think, and I don't know where that comes from. It may be, stories, personal experience, but it was such a difference. And, that just goes to show that you move somebody out of their area of expertise where they have a lot of training and background and a way to really weight the variables appropriately. Because I think a lot of times, if I had Steph Davis's experience with climbing, maybe I would forego ropes. Maybe that would be an extra challenge
Right.
because I'd have so much experience with how my body moves against the rock faces,
Right.
how to hold on, how to get my body up, how to sync up my body in the world in the rock face.
Right.
So, but I don't have that. So I'm distracted by all kinds of things.
Right.
So instead of thinking about just how the best way to get up the wall, I'm thinking about things like, how do I even get my hand in that crack in order to get a grip, or, how do I get my leg up there, or what have you, stuff that just comes naturally and very
Right.
automatically to her.
Right. And that's you have a good portion of your book to explain those kind of things. And we have a couple of questions from the listeners that I want to tune
Sure.
into. So someone asked, so if you have the gas and the brake, what causes us to have mixed feelings? Because we have the gas and the brake, and so that's one question. How do we know, why do we have mixed feelings if we actually have this like great risk calculator in our brain?
Because we have so many sort of disparate, information. A lot of times we have mixed feelings, I think. 'Cause like I said, they're weighting variables. We have an optimal circuit, but we can have mixed feelings for a variety of reasons. There may be different environmental variables. We may be very emotional. We may be very stressed, which is sort of weighting things in the wrong way. But also these two areas, it's not like it's you want to go and your frontal lobe is saying, oh, no, no, no. A lot of times it's like a weird back and forth conversation. And if it's a really conscious conversation, you can become that person, like, actually talking to yourself, well, if I do this, or, oh, if I do that. I mean, that's the thing. We like to talk about the brain as if it's a very rational, logical machine.
Right.
It's going to work as a calculator. It's going to give us the best answer. But the thing is that the best answer, the optimal answer, depends on any situation at all. Really depends on so many outside factors.
Right,
And if we try
exogenous
to
factors, right? We just
yeah,
don't know, they're outside of the system. So even though we have a brain that is this fantastic calculator, there are things like our friends and
yep,
who knows what, the weather. I mean, it could be lots of different things that regardless of our incredible calculator, it's just stuff happens, right? I
uh,
actually had a friend who he was a rock climber. He would go up into the mountains and climb in the snow. And I said, what? I'm just curious, what allows you to, like, how can, it was just very similar to the conversations. And he's like, you know what, because I never take, all my risks are calculated. I measure and I think about it and I have a plan for everything. I have a plan for this happens. I plan for that. I have a plan for this. And and as I was reading his book, it was unsettling because he actually died in one of those accidents because he couldn't predict probably something with the weather. There was something that he couldn't predict, even though your brain may actually have all the algorithms. Life sometimes happens, right? Like you could come up with
right.
all the different scenarios and you can't predict it. But it was so unsettling because as I was reading your book, I kept on thinking, oh God, like what happened? Like what happened? You actually talk about a neurosurgeon who's like got all the things planned out, but even with the best plans, life happens, right?
That's right.
You can't predict. Lightning could have struck him. I mean, I really don't know what happened, but he got into some, and I know he's a great planner, but even in those great circumstances, stuff still happens,
It
right?
does.
Yeah.
And
Um,
that's the hard part because, that's the other thing. We like to think that we're in control.
mhm.
I talk about a little bit about this in the book later too, about how important it is for us to feel like we're in control and that our decision, it is going to take us where we actually want it to take us.
Right.
And sometimes it doesn't. But I
Yeah.
think a lot of that indecision, it really is things going back and forth. And a lot of times it's because you don't have the experience. You
Right.
don't have enough background to really know all the knowns and the unknowns to
Right.
really understand the optimal choice.
Yeah, and in his case, he's out in nature, right? There could have been a
Mhm.
bear that ran up. I mean, who knows? Like things that you
Yeah.
just couldn't have predicted. Okay, then the other question was someone had asked if what happens if you had the head trauma? So you have a brain that's optimal function, but what happens when your brain, or could head traumas or other injuries prevent you from thinking clearly?
And the answer to that is yes. There's actually a lot of, obviously, where on your head the trauma occurs and where the damage occurs is going to vary what kind of results you have. But what you see with a lot of people who have head traumas or even, post-traumatic stress disorder, you see more impulsive behavior. You see people who are really affected by emotions, so much so that it's really hard for them to regulate and put that down, and that can interfere with decision making as well. If there's damage to the frontal lobe, then you've lost sort of that regulator. So you have people who are kind of always trying to go after rewards without thinking about what the consequences might be. Like, oh, I really want that lady's wallet full of money, but oh, if I take it, I might go to jail.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so it can really get in the way.
Yeah.
And there's certainly plenty of evidence. If you look at the neuroscience, the way a lot of neuroscience studies started was in neuropsychology, where we looked at people who had head injuries or different brain lesions and looked at how those areas in the brain that were damaged, how it affected behavior. Parkinson's disease, what you see in some people, and that's a loss of dopamine neurons. And a lot of people think about Parkinson's disease as being a motor problem. You know about the tremors and the difficulty initiating movements and stuff like that. But also people with Parkinson's disease have a lot of trouble making simple decisions. And so when you give them cognitive tasks, they really struggle because they don't have dopamine. They're helping to fuel this circuit and helping them decide.
And you talk about teens too, because they have hormonal things that are also happening in their brain that are making it harder for them to make these decisions, or testosterone in the case of men or women who are actually driving. So there are lots of these kind of factors that interrupt kind of the brain's
Yes,
normal
they
function.
can.
Yeah.
It means so much to me that you're listening to the show. Would love your support in any way by giving me comments below, or to subscribe to the show, or share the show with friends. Thank you again for your support. Love and blessings.